So today we're continuing on with our discussion of Wallace Stevens's greatest and most ambitious poem, The Notes Towards the Supreme Fiction. Last time we didn't get that far, and this time I'm not really sure how far we're going to get. But my aim here is less to provide a kind of comprehensive or exhaustive reading of this poem. If we were going to do that, we would probably have to spend a whole semester on it. But rather, what I want to do here is principally give you a taste of what a philosophical reading of poetry might be, what it is that is embodied in Stevens' poetry in particular, and how his poetry embodies the ideas about the relationship between poetry and philosophy that are expressed in his essay on the figure of the youth as virile poet. And in particular, the idea that there's a kind of life, a kind of vitality, a sort of redemptive power in poetry that philosophy, at least as it's conventionally understood, doesn't possess. So there's a kind of continuation of the ambitions of philosophy within poetry, insofar as philosophy is an attempt to reconcile us to reality, to give us a sense of being at home in reality or having a place in it that is recognizably human. And Stevens here is very much a humanist, and this is a constant theme throughout our discussion. If there is some idea of the divine, it's one that Stevens takes a fairly ironic view towards. He wants, in general, to translate the weight of tradition within Western European culture about the divine, the Judeo-Christian tradition, broadly construed. He wants to translate that tradition into more deflated, more humanistic, more everyday concepts and language. And as a good modernist poet, as we saw last time, he's definitely someone who doesn't want to rest on the laurels of the past accomplishments of the great figures of the tradition. And quite the contrary, he sees those accomplishments, even though obviously he has respect for them, as more of an impediment to the pure, unadulterated, virginal perception of reality that the poet should be striving towards. And so the subject matter of the poem, Notes Towards the Supreme Fiction, is the nature of poetry itself, as we've been saying. And Stevens is trying to provide the parameters to this figure of the ephebe that he is constructed imaginatively, the novice or recruit into the mysteries of poetry. So Stevens frames himself as a kind of mystagogue, or a person who is going to initiate a new member into a sort of secret cult, if you will, or a distinct form of discipline or spiritual cultivation. And in laying out the account of poetry, he's giving us then an account of how one will become a poet oneself, and thereby how one will accomplish whatever it is that poetry is supposed to accomplish for oneself. This desire to be able to use poetry in order to make one's life into something. And we've seen that the basic parameters of the poem are that poem involves this idea of abstraction, which we said is not so much the idea of abstraction in the philosophical sense of something that's a very general concept that has a wide scope, but rather it's the idea that the poet abstracts from his perception what's real. So this is connected, actually, even though we think of abstraction sometimes as being very removed from reality, this is very closely tied to Stevens' understanding of what it is for the poet to be a realist. That is, they must abstract or remove, take out the content of their poetry from reality as they encounter it in the purest possible way. So we didn't get all the way through this section, but we'll continue on with that today, and then touch on the other two sections or parts which complete his doctrine of the nature of poetry. namely change and pleasure. So the poem must change and it must give pleasure. So the attitude towards change, this is very much going to involve a confrontation between Stevens and the tradition, especially the tradition of poetic apotheosis, understood as a kind of transcendence, very much influenced by the Platonic tradition, as a kind of transcendence of this changeable temporal reality in favor of a kind of entry into the realm of the eternal, viewing reality from an eternal perspective. Stevens' view of poetry is going to involve a kind of embrace of change along various dimensions, and it turns out to be a fairly complex process by which poetry embraces and affirms change. And then finally, pleasure. And pleasure becomes the culmination of the poem, and therefore we can infer that ultimately the abstractness and the change is going to be in the service of pleasure. What is the pleasure of poetry? It has a lot to do, I think, and this is just my personal opinion, but it has a lot to do with this idea that Stevens expressed that once one has abandoned belief in God, poetry takes its place as life's redemption. In a crude sense, one has to say that it's necessary. Maybe the one thing needful in life is that one is able to find a sufficient degree of pleasure in life. That is at least the kind of humanist approach that puts the issue of salvation to one side and says that, look, if I'm going to continue on living in life, life just can't be an uninterrupted misery. There's got to be some pleasure that I'm getting out of it. And so the question is really, what is this pleasure that poetry provides, and why is it necessary? Why isn't it enough to just, eat Cheetos and play video games? I realize that's a little bit anachronistic when it comes to anything Stevens would have had in mind. But why isn't it enough, I don't know, eat peanuts and watch the baseball game or something that would have been contemporary with Stevens, right? It's not enough to just have these sort of unchallenging pleasures, if you will. So pleasure itself involves a kind of challenge. The kind of pleasure that involves a kind of satisfaction with existence is going to involve a kind of challenge. And that's what poetry is going to provide us with. So we're not going to be able to, of course, delve deeply into each one of the stanzas of each one of the cantos of this poem today. But I did want to give you a sense of what the overall parameters are, where all of this is going. And hopefully with the sort of exemplary readings that I've already provided last time and that I'll continue to provide today, you can go on your own and continue the discussion. Ideally, I wouldn't be teaching this way. I'd love to be able to read the poem and go stanza by stanza and raise questions to get your ideas about, rather than having to present just my own reading at the beginning. So I can't emphasize enough how strongly I want you to take what I'm going to say as far from being the final word. It's not grounded in verifiable scholarship or anything like that. I can't claim that this is the reading, even if there is such a thing. I can't claim that this is Stevens' inner intention that he had in mind when he was creating this. What I want it to be is exemplary in order to spur you to your own reading, to get your own pleasure ultimately out of the poem, which is what the poem itself says you should be asking for from it. So that's a bit of a preamble. Now I just want to also quickly remind us of where we were last time. We were talking about, we went through the first three cantos of It Must Be Abstract. And we talked about the way in which Stevens lays out from the beginning his ambitions for poetry as a sort of post-religious brand of poetry. The death of God is from the beginning a kind of datum. The sun, remember, should bear no name. It shouldn't bear the name of Phoebus, Apollo, from the Greek pantheon, or any other god. The sun is just the sun. And our task as poets in the modern era is to approach it with that kind of pure virginal perception that isn't mythologizing it before we've even begun to see it. That's where the idea of abstraction comes from. That we take into our poem something that is taken from the perception. We don't just put into the poem a bunch of conventional ideas that we've inherited from our culture, from our religion, from our parents, and so forth. But we see it for ourselves. That's what poetry is good for, is providing something that's true that only we could see, and not something that everyone's already seen because it's conventional wisdom. He talked about the ennui of civilized life and the way in which this drives us to search for the first idea. This sort of, which I'm interpreting as a kind of a term that he uses for this pure perception that we're going to get if we're seeing things without our conceptual blinkers and our traditional ways of filtering reality. We saw that the poet's danger is to become so enraptured by his discoveries that he becomes a metaphysician. And this is very much a kind of stereotypically romantic danger, that the poet comes to feel a kind of exaltation that, eureka, I've found it. I've seen for the first time. No one has seen what I've seen. And as a result, I come to believe I've been transported into some kind of metaphysical realm or something, and I make up some whole metaphysical story about this. Or I become convinced that I've been absorbed into nature itself. And so Stevens is going to be very skeptical of this kind of idea. That's a trap. The exaltation is real, and we saw in Figure of the Youth as Real Poet, he talks about this feeling of exaltation. That's really an important part of poetic pleasure. But the key is to not get carried away with this. The poet is contrasted with the priest and the philosopher, because the priest and the philosopher desire what the poet has, which is the sort of fresh perspective on life. The poem refreshes life so that we share for a moment the first idea. That's what we get from an authentic or valid poem. We get to share what the poet saw that we were not able to see for ourselves because of our lack of vision. This satisfies our belief in an immaculate beginning. That is to say that we're not always latecomers to reality that have to inherit, or the regurgitations, to mix metaphors, of previous generations, right? Here, chew on this, the anthology of poetry from past generations, but that we can see things with as much originality as the great poets of the past saw. So it satisfies belief in an immaculate beginning and sends us to an immaculate end. That is to say, it provides us with a kind of pathway through life. It allows us to live our lives authentically and in a way that redeems existence, even in the wake of the death of God. So Stevens connects this with the idea of candor or candidness, a kind of honesty of perception and an honesty of expression. So when we become, distrustful of others, when we come to despair of the sincerity of humanity, poetry can reinvigorate our belief in candor and candidness. In the third canto, remember, there's this figure of the Arabian and his damned hubla, 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 how, which gets connected to the chanting of the wood dove and his hubla, who, which suggests this idea of poetry as sort of pushing the boundaries of the intelligible. The poem is always going to be the authentic poem, the valid poem, the poem that is abstracting its freshness of vision, is always going to be on the boundary of nonsense. So there's always this battle within poetry between lapsing into cliche, which of course is not poetry, authentic poetry, or on the other hand, saying something that's just not intelligible yet, this kind of nonsense. But the sweet spot, so to speak, that Stephen seems to be advocating here is this idea of poetry redeeming life by not necessarily by immediately making sense, but by opening a door to a future area of sense. It's a future area of sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense now. Maybe it seems very exotic, like the Arabian landscape would to a New Englander. So it doesn't seem something familiar to us now, but it's a future familiar. It's a future ordinary, perhaps, even though it's very extraordinary now and makes us uncomfortable, doesn't make sense. The poet is to speak the language of the future, in a sense. Okay, well, that brings us then to where we ended off last time. And of course, when we're talking about the first idea, originality, freshness of perception, it's inevitable that at some point Adam and Eve are going to make an appearance. Right? So in the first stanza of the fourth canto, he says, "The first idea was not our own. Adam in Eden was the father of Descartes, and Eve made air the mirror of herself, of her sons and her daughters. They found themselves in heaven as in a glass, a second earth. And in earth itself they found a green, the inhabitants of a very vanished green." So there's this picture here where he's, first of all, trying to undermine the traditional idea that Adam and Eve saw the world with virginal perception, which is a quite natural thing to believe about Adam and Eve, given that they were the first creatures. But from our modern perspective, humanity comes very late on the scene on the earth. There are all kinds of sentient creatures who perceived the earth before we did, from a naturalistic perspective. And even with Adam and Eve already, I mean, especially if you think of Adam, literally the Adam and Eve that appear in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is written at a date that, has a lot of civilization under the bridge already. So the perceptions of the nature of men and women and of authority and of humanity's relationship to the earth as farmers, for example. This is not something that, even the first Homo sapiens imagined. Already, this is kind of a mirror of human civilization that you see in the myth as it's constructed in Genesis. It's already a reflection of an agrarian civilization, as opposed to hunter-gatherers, for example. So you get this idea, this perception of a myth as something that's a kind of mirroring of humanity. And that's what he's describing here as the situation with Adam and Eve. Adam was like Descartes, someone just introspecting, perceiving himself, and then having to infer that, well, the world must be my idea, right? Eve makes a mirror out of the air. They have heaven as in a glass, and the idea seems to be here a looking glass, a reflection. And what they found a green, the inhabitants of a very varnished green. I might have misspoke earlier and said vanished, but a very varnished green, right? It's a green that's not pure and innocent, but that's already been made over in human perspective, right? It's not the raw wood, but it's a varnished wood. But the first idea was not to shape the clouds in imitation. The clouds preceded us. There was a muddy center before we breathed. You think of the idea of Adam and Eve being made from the earth. There was all kinds of stuff, all kinds of material, and I think here he probably has in mind all kinds of predecessor species out of which we evolved. Right? So humanity, even Adam and Eve, came late on the scene. So this first idea is not something that we can attribute to our first parents. There's something more primary. There's a kind of, even you could say, a kind of perception that we would need to get in touch with that precedes the way of perceiving of the agrarian man, the agrarian kind of civilization that produced the book of Genesis. There was a myth before the myth began, venerable and articulate and complete. From this, the poem springs. The true poem springs from the myth, the original myth, the primordial myth, which isn't, the stuff that we have preserved in our sacred writings, but something more fundamental than that. What is it? Well, that's what the poet is seeking, to somehow discover this or rediscover it. We live in a place that is not our own and much more not ourselves. And hard it is in spite of blazoned days. We are the mimics. We are the mimics. Monkey see, monkey do. We mimic nature, something more fundamental than us. We're echoes. Humanity is an echo. We are not the ones that are the originators of the original first idea. We are the mimics of it. Clouds are pedagogues. Clouds are our teachers. The air is not a mirror, but bare board, coolesse, bright, dark, tragic chiaroscuro, and comic color of the rose in which abysmal instruments make sounds like pips of the sweeping meanings that we add to them. You know, there's this great poem called The Universe, the Cosmos, and we just imitate that. And this is a very ancient idea of poetry, but he's putting his own spin on it. That the primal poem is the universe itself. It's the cosmos itself. The original idea of the primal poem isn't something that originated with human civilization, you know, metaphorically with Adam and Eve, the first sort of civilized humans. But it's much more primordial than that. In the next canto, number 5, he'll go on to discuss sort of the beast within, right? This is sort of the primal animal. We are humans. We have this thin layer. You can think of it as a thin varnish of civilization, a thin veneer of civilization that's covered over our bestial nature. And this is a fun canto. He goes through and describes the lion roaring in the enraging desert. The elephant breaches the darkness of Ceylon with blares. You know, you can just hear the bellow of the elephant in the jungle. It talks about thunder and snow and, you know, the bear and all the forces of nature. And then he goes on to say, so we're skipping to the fourth stanza of this canto. At summer thunder and sleeps through the winter snow, but you, Ephebe, look from your attic window, your mansard with a rented piano. You lie in silence upon your bed. You clutch the corner of the pillow in your hand. You writhe and press a bitter utterance from your writhing, dumb yet voluble dumb violence. What's going on there? It's this image of there's this storm outside, and this Ephebe, right, this wannabe poet, is up at night, obviously in a state of restlessness, in this house that's, you know, got a mansard with a rented piano. A mansard is sort of, you know, one of those windows that juts out of a sloped roof. So, you know, typically that would be where the kids were, up there, right, in the bedrooms with the sloped roofs and little mansards where the window would jut out. You could sit in there. So this is the young poet sitting there, restless. Is the poet afraid? Is the poet dreaming, having a nightmare? Clutching the corner of the pillow, writhing and pressing a bitter utterance? I mean, is the poet frustrated? Is the poet afraid? Is the poet, you know, awake or asleep? You know, it's left ambiguous. But then there's a awakened state that is described next, when he says, you look across the roofs as sigil and as ward, or sigil rather, as sigil and as ward, and in your center mark them in our cow. The sigil is like the flag that would have the coat of arms on it, right? So it's associated with like a battle flag in a medieval battle. And the ward, it's kind of like standing lookout on the castle walls, is the kind of image there. Right, so the poet is this person standing in his sort of civilized Victorian house, looking out as if you were a soldier, a medieval knight on the castle walls, looking out and guarding against all of these lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, right? And this horrendous stormy weather. It's the image of the poet is kind of this thin. Sort of thin gray line, so to speak, or thin blue line, as they used to refer to the police force, between civilization and the jungle, the law of the jungle. So there, you know, this is the primordial, you know, reality of nature. This sort of violent situation. Canto 6 discusses the weather, and the weather as a kind of metaphor for abstraction. And I think the key stanza here is if you skip 5 down, he says, apparently referring to the weather, although I could be incorrect about this, but he says it must be visible or invisible, visible or invisible or visible or both, a seeing and unseeing in the eye. Then the next stanza, the weather and the giant of the weather, say the weather, the mere air, an abstraction blooded as a man by thought. An abstraction blooded. The weather and the giant in the weather. The weather is the weather, thunder, lightning. The giant in the weather here seems to refer to, again, like Phoebus earlier in the sun, right? It was the god that's in the sun. The old typical human tendency to want to divinize nature and to say, well, it's thundering now because, pick your favorite god, Wotan, Odin, Zeus, Yahweh, whoever, is angry at us, right? That's why it's thundering. That's the giant in the weather. But of course, his recommendation here, which you've already seen, is just say the weather, the mere weather. It's the weather. It's not Zeus. The mere air, an abstraction bloodied or blooded. The abstraction, preserve the weather as an abstraction, but still make it human. Give it blood. The metaphor is symbolically representing kind of human significance to us. Next canto, it feels good as it is without the giant, a thinker of the first idea. Perhaps the truth depends on a walk around a lake, composing as the body tires, a stop to see hepatica, a stop to watch a definition growing certain, and a wait within that certainty, a rest in the swags of pine trees bordering the lake. It feels good as it is without the giant. It feels good to just regard the weather as weather rather than having to view it as through a religious or theological lens. And then you have this sort of very everyday scene, thinking as a walk around a lake, stopping to look at the flowers, taking a rest under the pine trees on the side of the lake. Perhaps there are times of inherent excellence. Perhaps we don't need some divine reality in order to give excellence and greatness to nature. Perhaps there's an inherent excellence in itself, just as it is, without needing to reach for some higher reality. The final sentence, second to the last stanza, begins referring to moments of awakening, extreme, fortuitous, personal, in which we more than awaken. These moments of awakening. One of there's kind of traditional term epiphany, which sometimes has religious connotation, but in modernist literature, in both the British and the American context, in Stevens's period, first half of the 20th century, this came to refer to the idea of these sort of moments of awakening, like a sudden insight, where we seem to see reality clearly. And perhaps this is the kind of inherent excellence, the kind of Swiss perfection that he refers to, a kind of perfection that's inherent and that doesn't require being situated within some kind of theological narrative of salvation or what have you. We more than awaken, sit on the edge of sleep as on an elevation and behold the academies like structures in a mist. Again, there's this theme that we've seen persistently in this moment of true poetic insight, the academies, the philosophical world of that kind of abstraction, the kind of rationalization, rational systematization of nature seems like something very far off from our state of mind, where we're at a more essential level in these moments of epiphany when we awaken. Can we compose a castle fortress home, begins Canto 8, even with the help of Violet Leduc, and set the McCullough there as a major man. Violet Leduc was a famous restorer of especially medieval French cathedrals like Notre Dame in Paris. After the French Revolution, a lot of these got trashed. and he came and restored a lot of these. So he's saying, well, can we create a new castle? This becomes a metaphor for a new religion. And set the McCullough there as a major man. The McCullough here seems to refer to something. It's kind of like, Jeeves, this in this sense. This name Jeeves. Jeeves, kind of a stereotypical name for like a butler type figure. And set him there as major man. This major man has a kind of double meaning, I think, here. Or a triple meaning, perhaps. So I think major man here in this poem is going to refer to sort of the Platonic ideal of man, which in the philosophy of Ludwig Feuerbach became the particular interpretation of God as a kind of, that's Feuerbach, became the interpretation of God as a kind of projection of humanity's ideal qualities. So major man in that sense can refer to, with a kind of ironical or skeptical tinge, can refer to God. If you think of major man as kind of a Feuerbachian idea of God, the major man, the man that is the sort of epitome of man, the Platonic image of man, that then becomes something that we're going to worship or treat as an object of worship. We also have the idea of the major domo, which seems to be what the kind of the major man is immediately referring to here, who is sort of like the head butler, right? The steward of a great manor or a great house. And so the McCullough there is the major man. It's like, can we create a new religion and set some new God up there? But clearly it's a very ironical, very tongue-in-cheek, very kind of disparaging way of characterizing it, right? Because it's saying like God is like, in a lot of people's popular conception, a kind of vulgarized conception of the divine views God as like this butler who's, keeping heaven tidy for us, so that after we die, he's going to open up the door and say, "Welcome, master, welcome into heaven." Right? That's what God is. God's the guy up there making sure that heaven is in working order and everything's all dusted and the kitchen's kept well stocked and everything, so that when we die, God will open up the door like Jeeves the butler and let us in. That seems to be the idea here, the McCullough. That's one interpretation anyway. The first idea is an imagined thing, the pensive giant prone on violent space, maybe the McCullough. Right? There's the giant. That's my verification for saying that the major man here is God. McCullough is viewed as a god because earlier he referred to the giant as the giant of the weather, right? Which is the god. So the pensive giants prone in violent space may be the McCullough, an expedient, logos and logic, crystal hypothesis. He seems to be referring here specifically to the kind of philosopher's God, the rational conception of God. So like a Kant will say, look, there has to be a God because we are aware of our being subject to and obligated by the moral law. And how could we be subject to the moral law if there weren't going to be some God to reward the good and punish the evil? So God is kind of posited there as kind of like a requirement, in the same way that you might say, look, if you're going to maintain a big manor house, you've got to have a McCullough in there. You've got to have some butler. You've got to have a Jeeves, someone in there to take care of it. That seems to be something like the spirit in which he's saying this. But the McCullough is McCullough. It does not follow that the major man is man. Maybe these sorts of abstractions, and there's a kind of criticism of a kind of bad abstraction here, right? The kind of idealized view of man. It doesn't follow that major man is man. If McCullough himself lay lounging by the sea, drowned in its washes, reading in the sound about the thinker of the first idea, he might take habit, whether from wave or phrase or power of the wave or deep in speech or leaner being moving on in him, of greater aptitude and apprehension, as if the waves at last were never broken, as if language suddenly with ease said things it had laboriously spoken. In other words, this God is a puny God, this McCullough, this butler God, right? this constructed by theologians and people with theologians' blood in them, as Nietzsche might have said about Kant. This butler that's keeping heaven. Let's take this McCullough, let's put him in the ocean. Let's put him in touch with nature, in other words. And then we'll see maybe that there's a deeper sort of apprehension of the divine that goes with the powers of the wave, the speech of the wave, that the sound of the wave sort of being a metaphor here for a kind of deeper sense of meaning than these rational ideas of God. Okay. So there's I'm going to skip over the ninth, where I think there's just a kind of a continuation of this idea of contrasting reason and philosophy in relation to God and poetry and emotion in relation to God, the two kind of approaches to the idea of God and how they relate to nature. So the final canto, 10. The major abstraction is the idea of man, and major man is his exponent. The expounder is the abstracted man. Right? It's the abstraction of man that is the exponent of the major man. Abler in the abstract then is in his singular. That is to say that these puny ideas of God as major man are endowed with all kinds of power in the theories of these theologians and philosophers. God is the supreme being and has all the omni properties. But the people who come up with these ideas, he's saying, right, the expounder of the major man, are not very powerful. They're the people who lack power. There's it's the philosopher and the priest, the hieratic figure as opposed to the virile poet. This is very much the kind of Nietzschean idea that Wallace Stevens develops from Friedrich Nietzsche. More fecund as principle than particle, happy fecundity, florabundant force, is being more than an exception. The heroic part of the communal, the major abstraction is the communal. This major man abstraction, this common conventional ideas. But there's something more divine, as it were. Then at the end here, there's this, it strikes me as a kind of allusion to Nietzsche's madman who's declaring the death of God. And, the idea that these common ideas of the divine, this sort of abstract idea of man that isn't really virile, is something that, is still in Stevens's situation, has a kind of residual life. It still is a kind of conventional wisdom. So he goes on to say, what rabbi grown furious with human wish, what chieftain walking by himself crying most miserable, most victorious, does not see these separate figures one by one, and yet see only one in his old coat, his slouching pantaloons, beyond the town, looking for what was where it used to be. Cloudless in the morning, it is he, the man, that old coat, those sagging pantaloons. This is, I'm not sure exactly where I get this from, but it evokes the idea of Nietzsche's madman. The man, that old coat, those sagging pantaloons. It is him, ephebe, to make, to confect the final elegance, not to console nor sanctify, but plainly to profound. It's a kind of figure of the poet, the impoverished poet, as a kind of madman who's propounding in a way that even, the rabbi who really, really, really wants there to be this traditional God, the chieftain, right, who's kind of a catch-all figure for a kind of figure of religious authority. The poet is proclaiming to these figures what they cannot deny, namely the death of this idea of the major man, this sort of abstracted theologian's conception of God. So it ends on, I think, if this reading is at all apt, it ends on a kind of a negative note here. It must be abstract. We kind of actually, we sort of turned full circle, right? Because we started with the this kind of a declaration of the death of God in relation to the Son, and then we turn full circle back to this same point of view, having in the meantime circled around to this idea of a more original, fresh perception of nature. Now, nature is typically understood as something that changes. And so I think, again, the kind of basic contrast that's going to go on in the second part, it must change, is a contrast between the various human attempts to try to freeze nature, to try to grasp something that's eternal and unchanging. And that's contrasted with the authentic poet's belief in the necessity of change, in the affirmation and embrace of change. So, in the first three, I'm just going to, because of time, I'm just going to kind of summarize what we have in the first three cantos. You have, I think, very amusing, at least to my taste, parodies of religion, patriotism, and military glory, in a way that makes it clear that these, the old, let's say, even like 19th century views of religion, patriotism, military glory, have become sort of dated for us. These no longer generally appeal, at least not to those who, have Wallace Stevens's kind of sensibility. They no longer really appeal. Then in the fourth, there's this bit of philosophy, a bit of yin-yang philosophy that I think doesn't require a lot of philosophical commentary. He says in the first stanza of Canto 4, two things of opposite natures seem to depend on one another, as a man depends on a woman, day on night, the imagined on the real. This is the origin of change. Now, I mean, if he means this flat-footedly and straightforwardly, I think you have to be honest here. This does sound a little bit cliched and conventional. It's like I said, it's this kind of yin-yang idea that change is a matter of a kind of dynamic interaction or dialectical interaction between these opposites that need each other, just as north and south, man and woman, sailor and sea, and so on. So perhaps there's a way to read this as being more ironical, but it does seem to be what he is wanting to affirm. The necessity of change. Canto 5 is a little bit of a narrative vignette about even a kind of allegory, you could say, of humanity's sojourn in nature. That we come into this situation of undespoiled nature with all of its, fecundity and fertility and beauty and richness and lushness. And we're inspired by that. We're inspired by all of the beauty of nature, all of its diversity, all of its fertility, to replicate it, to imitate it. Remember, in an earlier part of the poem, he described ourselves as mimics of nature. And so we produce our civilization, but then we die. Right? So the poem actually begins in medias res here, in the middle of things. It begins with a kind of scene, somewhat like the famous scene, let's say at a lower level, but the scene in Shelley's Ozymandias, the poem which is the description of the legs of this magnificent monumental statue, and its inscription that says, "Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. I am Ozymandias, King of Kings." So this image is kind of the Egyptian pharaohs, or in parallel form, we could think of all of the different great supreme monarchs of the ancient world, and where are they now? Right, the desert in Shelley's poem, the desert has reclaimed it, and in Stevens's parallel account here in Canto 5, the jungle, the Caribbean jungle has reclaimed it. There's some other vignettes of this similar nature where he's sort of, emphasizing in poetic form the futility and sort of really almost the kind of pathetic character of the human ambition to try to find something that's eternal, given that we are part of nature, which is always in this state of fluctuation and change. So the perfection of the spring night is described in Canto 7, which is contrasted with the scholar and the changing fluctuation of the scholar's knowledge. In the last couple stanzas, he says here, this is Canto 7, Part 2. As in the courage of the ignorant man who chants by book, in the heat of the scholar who writes the book, hot for another inaccessible bliss, the fluctuations of certainty, the change of degrees of perception in the scholar's dark. So you have this preceding description, and you read it for yourself, of the beauty of a late spring or May night, and the sense of absoluteness that one can get from that. And the scholar's attempt to find certainty. Think about the philosopher attempting to construct a metaphysical system and deduce everything with rigorous logic. And then maybe having moments where he feels like, I've finally done it. I finally achieved the certainty. I have a kind of eternal truth in front of me, but it's fluctuating. The change in the degrees of perception, right? The insight of the scholar comes and goes. So it's another one of these contrasts between the failure and the despair of the philosopher and the scholar on the one hand, and the success of the poet, who is able to have this sort of fresh vision of reality. Canto 8 discusses Nanzia Nuncio, which is a kind of made up name. Nanzia seems to be, I think Stevens selected this as a kind of African sounding name, right? So it's which of course is the idea of, this is, the attempt to get back to the primordial, to get back to a kind of pristine, natural form of existence. And the nuncio this is the term for the a delegate of the Pope who's going to announce, right, proclaim things. So this seems to be a figure of a kind of a hippie figure, you could say, in a way, right? It's sort of like a new age kind of person who has the belief that they understand sort of how to get back and have a kind of primal religion, right? These are sort of the Wiccans, right? This is the sort of neo-pagan kind of attitude that is embodied in this idea of Nancy and Nuncio. And Ozymandias, who I just mentioned earlier, or Ozymandias, I'm not exactly sure what the better pronunciation is sort of the figurative or metaphorical spouse of this Nancy and Nuncio, their idea of nature, right? And clearly he has a kind of parodic and skeptical view of this as much as he does any other attempts for us to humanize nature, to believe that we can, negate its essential otherness and somehow become one with it. Okay. We're almost out of time, so there's not much that I'm going to be able to say about It Must Give Pleasure, which is unfortunate because in a lot of ways this is the acme of the poem and the ultimate sort of goal of poetry itself. I think it's fair to read this, and I guess I'll leave this as sort of exercises for you to do on your own, to think about what are the ways in which poetry pleases. And he seems to be going through some of these ways in which poetry pleases, the sort of the mythical and narrative building function of poetry, the ways in which poetry can impose order on things, the ways in which poetry can, again, abstract the pure vision and give us a sense of what's real. And I think that for Stevens is the ultimate point of it, is to cut through all the baloney and to give us a sense of what's real. And there's a pleasure in that itself. There's a pleasure in truth. There's a pleasure in, getting back to what's basic and where we can't go any deeper. And that's ultimately what we enjoy. But we enjoy everything he will say like men. We enjoy, it's a very humanistic understanding. This is not a pleasure that involves becoming divinized, right? Or an apotheosis, becoming higher than what we are in nature. But this is our natural sort of form of pleasure as human beings, is to think and to imagine and to, encounter truth. And that's ultimately how poetry is going to please us. So that'll have to do it for Stevens. Unfortunately, as I suggested at the beginning, I just want to get you started. I want to empower you, get over that, maybe that sense of, obscurity and difficulty and being overwhelmed that can sometimes strike us when we first encounter modernist poetry, to think through it on your own and to derive pleasure from it, if possible. And we're going to be continuing on with another great modernist poet, T.S. Eliot, next time. And as we did with Stevens, we're going to first be looking at some of the poet's prose criticism and literary theory. And you've been given that. I sent it out by email on the use of poetry and the use of criticism. And then we'll discuss one of his great later poems, Ash Wednesday, later this week and the beginning part of next week. So I look forward to doing that and seeing you again next time.